Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Command & Conquer Red Alert 2 for PC. This is a real-time strategy game, the sequel to Command & Conquer Red Alert and the follow-up to Command & Conquer Tiberian Sun. It was released in October of 2000, developed by Westwood and published by EA, and generally I find that it's one of the more beloved titles in the Command & Conquer series. In fact, the only title in the series that I hear people praise more is the original Command & Conquer Red Alert. So right off the bat, you know that this thing has a lot of nostalgia going for it, but how is it as a game, and does it still stand up after around 15 years at this point? Or is what people say about it just pure nostalgia and not much else? Well, before we really get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, which is running on an updated version of the same engine that powered Tiberian Sun, which means that it does have support for modern resolutions, and it is all 2D isometric, and they did add in a few things here and there to actually differentiate this engine from just plain Tiberian Sun. For example, you now have the ability to see units that are behind buildings as opposed to just being able to only see the units that are in front of buildings. And even then, the way they handle that is actually not very elegant. They basically just added a triangular circle around the unit so that you have some indication of an unit being behind a building. And unfortunately, that really doesn't help all that much, and you find that it would be a lot better if it did what, say, Age of Empires did, which is to outline the unit in that particular color of the player. So if you were, say, the red player, then your units behind buildings would just appear as a red silhouette of that particular unit, as opposed to just having this weird triangular circle thing that doesn't really help all that much. But other than that, the sprite work is more detailed than the previous game, Tiberian Sun, and there is actually a lot of detail packed into this game. They did a very, very good job with the visuals in this thing. It's nice and colorful, the effects are better, but there is one really big problem that it has compared to Tiberian Sun even, and that is that it will not run properly on anything newer than Windows XP. So if you're like me and you're trying to run this on Windows 7, particularly 64-bit Windows 7, it's going to crash a lot for no discernible reason. Tiberian Sun had a similar issue, but it was less significant. It didn't crash anywhere near as much as Red Alert 2 does. I have not been able to play Red Alert 2 for longer than maybe 15 minutes at a time, particularly when I'm in a skirmish. If I'm in the campaigns, it generally runs a bit better and doesn't crash as much, but during the skirmishes in particular, for some bizarre reason, it will just crash after about 15 to 20 minutes. And that is downright infuriating. And it doesn't seem like there's much of anything you can do to fix it. I mean, the game still runs on Windows 7, it just crashes constantly, and I can't figure out why, and I can't do anything to fix it. No matter whether I'm running various compatibility modes, or what it may well be, this thing just refuses to work properly on a modern operating system. Which kind of boggles my mind, because once you manage to get the original Command & Conquer and Red Alert running at all on a modern operating system, they run perfectly. They never crash or anything like that unless you manage to somehow royally screw something up. And yet, the newer games in the series that are still 2D somehow broke. I don't know. Anyway, the presentation continues with the sound design, which is about how you saw with Tiberian Sun. The difference being that the music is definitely a lot more what we've come to establish as the Red Alert vibe, which is this just kind of heavy industrial sound that just really gets you pumped up for the battle. And once again, the soundtrack is by Frank Klepacki, and it is absolutely friggin' fantastic. From the heavier tracks to the groovier tracks, it's all incredibly memorable and extremely good to listen to. And then there's the rest of the sound design, where the voice acting, once again, they do a lot with the FMV cutscenes, only this time they're actually really high quality compared to the previous games. They're still low resolution, but they're higher quality, so they have aged considerably better. And they got some pretty good actors to do their thing in this one as well, so that really does help. And unfortunately, I can't actually show you any footage of the cutscenes because for some reason they just wouldn't record. That's an issue I had with Tiberian Sun as well, so it seems to be an issue with the way that the video formats are handled on this particular engine, but oh well. The voice acting in general is pretty solid stuff, and even though they do kind of overplay the accents on the Russian side of things, and it's actually rather corny in a lot of spots, it's actually pretty endearing, and the game is clearly not meant to be taken all that seriously. And that's something that the previous games in the series were lacking, especially Tiberian Sun. That game was pretty dark. And then you get to Red Alert 2, and even though it does have some pretty heavy stuff going on, it's done with this kind of lightheartedness that is really refreshing for the series, and the sense of humor that the game has is actually pretty good. It's not amazing, but it's pretty good, and the actors do a lot to sell that. But then there's the sound effects, which are the only real letdown of the presentation. They're just okay. They're nothing particularly amazing. They work, and that's about all you can say for them. But as fantastic as the presentation is, it really doesn't hold a candle to the story or the gameplay, because those are what are going to make or break this thing for you. And the story in this is set after the events of the original Red Alert, in which the Allies won and set about sort of disarming Russia. And in so doing, they basically reduced all of their air capabilities and left the Russians to decide to build tanks and pursue other more unusual methods, like the psychic Yuri, who is an advisor to the Premier Romanov. And what ends up happening is that Russia eventually decides that they've had enough of the Allies and just straight up invades. And from there, you start with World War III. And from there, you once again split into two different campaigns with two separate storylines that sort of, kind of work together in that they're opposite sides of the story. You either play as the Allies or you play as the Soviets. And if you're playing as the Allies, you're basically trying to fight off Russia at first, and then you go from there into straight up fighting back. And if you're the Soviets, then you just are working on your plans for world domination. And the plot itself is more coherent than the previous game in the series, the original Red Alert, but at the same time, it's still not all that compelling. You are still just kind of this faceless commander who's just kind of there and just happens to be pretty much the best that particular side has got. And while they do have better characters this time around, where some of them actually have personalities this time around, as opposed to just kind of being cardboard cutouts, they ultimately don't really have all that much in the way of arcs, and you don't really see a lot of character development as you're going through the game. Whether you're playing as the Allies or the Soviets, doesn't really matter. But you do get some rather nice cutscenes to go along with what you're doing, and it adds a lot of character to the game, considering that it actually has a sense of humor about things. And this is something that Tiberian Sun really lacked. It didn't really have much in the way of a sense of humor to really lighten up the mood, because it was a pretty dark game. This one is really not all that dark if you really go into it and play it. Why? Because it doesn't take itself all that seriously. You have people saying ridiculous things, you have ridiculous units, you have things like psychic powers that will take control of various units and things like that. It's just kinda campy, and it works really well for this particular game, actually. I mean, we've all seen the whole Soviets versus Allies World War III scenarios time and time again. It's become a very tired cliche in and of itself in this kind of Tom Clancy-esque world, but this one goes a different route, and it really does stand as its own unique entity, and that's a very good thing. It helps that it has some kind of fun and interesting characters to go along with it, even if they don't really have much development over the course of the game. And what you end up with is a story that's not necessarily compelling because it's well written or anything like that, but is fun to play just because it doesn't take itself seriously. You just go in and you have fun. And that's what this game really feels like it's made for. It feels like it's made for fun rather than to actually be a good strategy game. This is where the gameplay comes in, and this is where things actually kind of fall apart for this game. Now, it doesn't really fall completely apart. It's still based on the same general principles that the original Red Alert and Tiberian Sun were built on. And it actually plays a lot more like Tiberian Sun than it does Red Alert. Simple reason for this is they took what Tiberian Sun did, which is two wildly different factions where they had just completely separate units and everything like that, and they transplant that into the Allies versus Soviets thing. So instead of having just a general infantry unit this time around, the Allies get GIs while the Soviets get conscripts. And they're pretty wildly different units, even though they do serve the same purpose, which is to have just some general infantry. But the problem becomes when you try to develop strategies with these particular sides. Because, once again, the Soviets prefer brute force over anything else, and just this big tank rush or conscript rush, which I'm going to show you a conscript rush in skirmish mode here, just so you can see what I'm talking about. But the Allies have different ways of doing things. They're a bit more defensive, they have more combined arms, that kind of thing. And ultimately, there's only so much you can do with the strategy in this game. It's still a very simplistic RTS. And you do have some basic counters that you can do, which is basically machine guns and other infantry are good against infantry, vehicles are good against other vehicles, and that's kind of it, really. And what you end up with is things like this conscript bum rush, where very early in the game, you can get completely overwhelmed by a Soviet player who knows what they're doing. And eventually the Soviets can get a building called the cloning vat, which is to say that they get 2 infantry units for the price of 1. Now, considering conscripts are really cheap and train extremely quickly, while also just being generally powerful infantry units, at least when en masse, they ultimately end up being completely overpowered, in my opinion, in that you can just have this massive army of conscripts supported by only a few tanks, and you will completely wipe the floor with everybody else. And Allies have a really hard time actually coming up with a strategy to defeat that other than just building a lot of defensive structures. And since all of their stuff is generally more expensive than what the Soviets get, that can be pretty problematic. It's not completely broken. I mean, there are ways you can defeat a conscript bum rush if you know what you're doing, but it's still very limiting in terms of strategy. There's only a few things that will work one way or another, and ultimately it ends up being a lot like the previous games. It doesn't really matter as much what you're trying to do and what strategy you develop. It matters more how many units you have. And by the time this thing came out, there had been strategy games prior to this that were about more than just unit numbers, and we had already seen the writing on the wall. Strategy was going in a completely different direction. This thing is basically the last hurrah for the old school Command and Conquer style RTS, and it just wouldn't cut it afterward. So it was released at the right time, so to speak. The time when we were just finally getting over that, and we're like, okay, we'll accept it with this one, but from now on, we want to see something a bit different from you guys. We want to see this series evolve. And while it's a definite improvement gameplay-wise over Tiberian Sun, it's still ultimately a very simplistic RTS, and ultimately, that's going to make or break it for you. If you're okay with incredibly simplistic RTSs, this will work just fine, and you'll probably be able to get something out of it. But if you're not okay with that, like me, where I tend to play a lot more complex strategy games than this, then it may or may not work for you. I still managed to enjoy Red Alert 2, especially the campaigns. They are very well done, but the skirmish mode left a lot to be desired for me. And again, that's mostly because I'm used to more complex strategy games than this, and going back to something like this is a bit difficult. It's not as difficult as it was for the original Command & Conquers. I mean, this is still a pretty modern strategy game compared to those, and it's still a very easy game to get into, very easy to pick up and play. But it's still got that problem where I can't recommend it to everyone. If you're a CNC fan, chances are you've already played this, and you probably love it. But if you're not a CNC fan, then you may or may not like it. I can easily recommend this if you're wanting to get into the older school Command & Conquer games and you haven't played one of those yet. This one is way easier to get into than any of the prior Command & Conquer games, except maybe Tiberian Sun. And so, this is a good stepping stone if you're wanting to get into the older games. But, other than that, I have to give it a cautious recommendation, especially considering that it just doesn't run well on modern operating systems. If it ran better on modern operating systems, I would have an easier time recommending it, but I don't know if you'll be able to put up with the technical problems the game has on modern operating systems long enough to be able to actually get any enjoyment out of the game. Because, let's face it, it is a very simple game. Certainly more complex than its predecessors, but it does have some pretty limited appeal if you are an RTS fan and you've played more complex games than this. Thanks for watching.